I still remember that night like it just happened. The air was heavy, and the only sound in the house was the faint ticking of the old wooden clock in my grandfather's room. He had been sick for weeks, barely speaking, just staring at the ceiling like he was lost in deep thought. We all knew he didn't have much time left, but none of us were ready for what happened next. I was sitting by his bed, holding his frail hand, when he suddenly gripped my wrist tighter than ever before. His eyes, dull and tired, suddenly sparked with an intensity I had never seen. Then, in a voice that barely felt like his own, he whispered something to me. Words so strange, so unsettling, that I froze. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but before I could, he exhaled his last breath. The room fell into complete silence. I sat there, my mind spinning, trying to make sense of his final words. And then, before I could even process what had just happened, my dog Max, who had been lying quietly in the corner, suddenly jumped up. His ears perked, his body tense, and he let out a deep, low growl that sent chills down my spine. Max had always been a calm and gentle dog, never one to react without reason, but something had changed in him in that exact moment. He turned to look at me, his eyes wide and alert, as if he understood something I didn't. And then, without warning, he bolted out of the room and straight towards the hallway, towards the one place in the house my grandfather had always warned us about. I had no choice. I had to follow him. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Max had never acted like this before. His sudden reaction right after my grandfather's last words sent a wave of unease through me. The hallway he had run toward was dimly lit, the old wooden floor creaking beneath his paws as he disappeared around the corner. A strange feeling crept up my spine, but I forced myself to move. I had to know what was happening. As I stepped out of the room, the house felt different. The air was colder, heavier, like something unseen was pressing down on me. The hallway stretched out ahead, leading to a door that had always remained shut, my grandfather's old study. It was a place none of us were ever allowed to enter. He had never explained why, just that it was off limits and should be left alone. I never questioned it before, but now Max was standing in front of that very door, his body rigid, his tail low, and his ears pulled back. He let out a soft whimper before scratching at the door. I swallowed hard. My grandfather had always been a strict but kind man. He never raised his voice unnecessarily, never acted out of anger. But when it came to this room, his warnings had been firm. I had assumed it was just a place filled with old memories, maybe even painful ones, and that was why he never wanted us inside. But standing there now, with Max acting as if something was on the other side, I felt like there was more to it. I reached for the doorknob, my fingers trembling slightly. The metal was ice cold. Taking a deep breath, I twisted it. The door creaked open, revealing a room filled with dust-covered furniture, stacks of old books, and a large wooden desk pushed against the back wall. The heavy curtains were drawn shut, allowing only a sliver of moonlight to creep through the cracks. Everything seemed untouched, as if the room had been frozen in time. Max took a cautious step inside, sniffing the air, his body still tense. That's when I noticed it, a single framed photograph sitting at the center of the desk. It was old, the edges yellowed, but what caught my attention wasn't the picture itself. It was the way Max stared at it, his eyes fixed as if he recognized something. I stepped closer, brushing off the layer of dust, and my breath caught in my throat. The photo showed my grandfather as a young man, standing beside a dog that looked exactly like Max. The resemblance was uncanny, same markings, same piercing eyes. But that wasn't possible. Max was only 5 years old. And yet, as I looked down at him, his ears perked up, and he let out a low whine, almost as if he understood what I was thinking. A chill ran through me. I turned the frame over, my fingers shaking as I read the words scrawled on the back. And that's when I realized My grandfather's last words weren't random at all. They were a warning, and whatever he had tried to tell me, I was already too deep into it. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages of the old notebook. The handwriting was my grandfather's, neat but hurried, as if he had written in a rush. The first few pages were filled with dates and short notes, nothing unusual, until I reached the middle of the book. That's where things changed. The ink was darker, the words more frantic. If you're reading this, then it's already begun. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. What had begun? My grandfather had never been the type to believe in strange things, yet the way these words were written, I could feel the urgency behind them. Max let out a soft whimper, his nose pressing against the pages, as if he too could sense the weight of what was inside. The next entry sent a chill through me. The dog will know before you do. Trust him. He will lead you to the truth. I looked at Max, my heart pounding. My grandfather had known about him, long before I ever brought Max home, before I even knew I wanted a dog. But how? My mind raced, trying to connect the pieces. Max had reacted the moment my grandfather took his last breath. He had led me here. And now it felt like he was waiting for me to figure something out. I turned another page, my breath catching as I read the next few lines. The door must remain shut. If it opens, everything changes. I froze. Which door? My grandfather's study? Or was there another door I hadn't yet found? A sudden noise echoed from somewhere deep in the house. Max's ears shot up. Something or someone was moving. A sharp creak echoed through the house, and my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. Max's body stiffened, his ears perked as he let out a deep, low growl. My grip tightened around the notebook as my eyes darted toward the hallway. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't explain. Every instinct told me to stay put, but something stronger, maybe curiosity, maybe fear, forced me to move. Max took the lead, his paws silent against the wooden floor as we crept toward the source of the sound. The hallway stretched longer than it ever had before, each shadow twisting into shapes that made my pulse quicken. The house felt different now, as if it had been waiting for me to find the notebook, for me to understand something I wasn't ready to face. Then I saw it. A door. Not my grandfather's study, but another one I had never noticed before. It was at the very end of the hallway, partially hidden behind an old cabinet. My grandfather's words echoed in my head. The door must remain shut. But it wasn't shut. It was open, just a crack, enough for a sliver of darkness to spill out. Max let out another growl, his body tense. I swallowed hard, reaching out with a shaking hand. The air around the door felt colder, and the closer I got, the more something inside me screamed to stop. But I didn't. I pushed the door open. A rush of air hit me, carrying a scent I couldn't place. Something old, something unfamiliar. Max barked sharply, his eyes locked on something inside the room. I stepped forward, my heart hammering. And then, just as my foot crossed the threshold, I heard it, my grandfather's voice. But he was gone. The voice was faint, like a whisper carried on the wind, but I knew it was him. My grandfather. The same man I had watched take his last breath just hours ago. The sound sent chills through me, and for a moment I couldn't move. Max stood frozen beside me, his body tense, his gaze locked on the darkness beyond the open door. Then the voice came again, clearer this time, but still distant. You weren't supposed to open it. My stomach twisted. I turned back toward the hallway, half expecting to see him standing there, but the house was empty. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs. I wanted to believe my mind was playing tricks on me, that I was just overwhelmed with grief, but deep down I knew better. Something was wrong. Max took a step forward, his nails clicking against the wooden floor. He let out a whine, hesitant but drawn to whatever lay inside the room. The darkness beyond the doorway seemed deeper than it should be, as if the light from the hallway refused to touch it. My fingers tightened around the edge of the notebook. Every part of me screamed to turn back, to slam the door shut and pretend I never saw it. But I had already come this far. Taking a shaky breath, I stepped inside. The room was cold, much colder than the rest of the house. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old books and objects covered in dust, as if untouched for decades. A wooden chair sat in the center of the room, facing an old mirror that stretched from the floor to the ceiling. It was cracked along the edges, its surface clouded, but something about it made my skin crawl. Max let out a sharp bark, his reflection visible in the glass. But then my breath hitched, because for a brief moment I saw something else standing behind him. A shadow. It was tall, unmoving, and completely out of place. My pulse pounded in my ears as I turned, expecting to see someone behind us. But the room was empty. I spun back toward the mirror, my heart racing. The shadow was gone. But just as I started to breathe again, the reflection changed. It wasn't showing the room anymore. Instead, I saw a place I didn't recognize. An old, empty field beneath a dark sky. And in the center of that field stood a man. Not just any man. My grandfather. He was staring straight at me, and then, as if he could see me through the glass, he lifted his hand and pointed. Not at me. At Max. I couldn't move. My grandfather's reflection in the mirror felt too real, too intentional. He wasn't just standing there, he was looking directly at me, his expression serious, almost urgent. But it was his outstretched hand pointing at Max that made my blood run cold. Max whined softly, shifting uneasily under my gaze. I glanced down at him, my heart hammering. He looked the same, his usual brown eyes, his familiar stance. But doubt crept into my mind. My grandfather's notebook had warned me. The dog will know before you do. Trust him. But what did that mean? Had Max been leading me here? Or keeping me from something? I turned back to the mirror, my mouth dry. Grandpa? My voice came out barely above a whisper. The man in the reflection didn't respond, didn't move, just kept pointing. My stomach twisted. I had spent years trusting Max, believing he was just a loyal pet, a friend. But now, standing in this hidden room, facing something I couldn't explain, I felt something shift in the air around us. Then Max did something he had never done before. He growled. Not a warning growl, not out of fear, but something deeper, something almost human. My breath caught. His eyes flicked toward the mirror, and for the briefest moment, I swore I saw something else looking back. The mirror trembled, the glass rippling as if it were water. A gust of cold air surged through the room, and Max barked, stepping between me and the mirror. His body was tense, his hackles raised. My grandfather's reflection remained still, unwavering. But then, just as the air seemed to hum with energy, the glass cracked. A single jagged line split right through my grandfather's image, and the room around us shook. Then his voice came again. This time it wasn't a whisper, it was clear. Get out, now! My instincts screamed at me to listen, but something held me there. The notebook, the warnings, the door. Everything had led to this moment, but before I could react, Max lunged, not at me, at the mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, and for a brief second, everything around me disappeared into darkness. I felt myself falling into nothing, but just as quickly I hit the ground, gasping for breath. When I opened my eyes, I was in my grandfather's study again. The hidden room was gone, the mirror was gone, and Max was standing beside me, staring, his tail still and his eyes darker than before. I sat there on the floor, my breathing uneven, my heart still racing. The room was silent, the kind of silence that felt too heavy, too unnatural. Max stood beside me, his body still, his eyes locked onto mine. He looked the same, but something about him felt different. His eyes held an intensity I hadn't noticed before, as if he knew something I didn't. I turned my head, searching for the shattered remains of the mirror, for the hidden room I had stepped into, But there was nothing. Just my grandfather's study, exactly as it had always been. The bookshelves, the old desk, the thick curtains drawn over the windows. It was as if none of it had happened. But I knew it had. I could still feel the cold air from that dark space, still hear my grandfather's voice warning me. I reached for the notebook, my fingers trembling as I flipped through the pages. The words that had been there before, the warnings, the instructions, they were gone. The pages were blank. My stomach twisted, my mind racing for an explanation. Had I imagined it all? Had my grief created some impossible illusion? But Max's reaction, the way he had lunged at the mirror, the way he was staring at me now, it was real. It had to be. A deep unease settled in my chest. My grandfather had known something he had tried to keep hidden. And whatever it was, it hadn't left with him. It was still here. Max let out a low, almost thoughtful whine before turning toward the door. He walked out without looking back, as if he had already moved on. I hesitated before following, glancing one last time at the empty room. Everything looked normal, untouched, but I knew better now. As I stepped into the hallway, the air felt lighter, the house strangely quiet. Max led the way downstairs, his tail swaying slightly. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that it was over, that whatever had happened in that hidden room had ended when the mirror shattered. But just as I reached the last step, Max paused. His ears perked, his head tilting slightly. Then, without warning, he let out a low, guttural growl. Not at me, but at something behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. The cold chill creeping down my spine told me everything. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed.